Because there's some conditioning taking over, some bit of programming taking over. And yet there are moments of waking up from it, seeing it for what it is, knowing it as unwholesome, not being taken in. In Buddhist psychology, they talk about shamelessness. And in this case, we're talking about moral shame, not pathological shame. A lot of people walk around with a lot of shame, which isn't really moral shame. It's just they feel bad about themselves because they've been sat on in various ways. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the wholesome shame of recognize that you feel when you recognize that you've done something unwholesome. It's a wholesome feeling to feel shame about that. Oh my God. And wholesome shame isn't about your ego. It isn't about, oh no, I'm a bad person. That's another kind of diversion. It's about, oh, I hurt myself, I hurt someone else, And so in these moments where we go back into these unwholesome patterns, there's what the Buddhist psychology calls shamelessness about it. There's a way that we act in harmful ways, and in that moment that we're doing it, we feel a certain entitlement, we feel a certain shamelessness about it. And there it is. They kind of go together, that unconsciousness with the shamelessness. There's just a fragment of us there doing it, not the whole thing. And then at some point we come back into our wholeness.
Good.
All right. Yeah, well, the hell fear part of it is an addition, that's a further kind of development. But that feeling of, it's almost like hot water poured over you. It's the stinging kind of feeling if you feel like you've done something wrong. And, in little sensitive beings, sometimes it's done much too harshly. It may have come out of what was done to them.
Oh, guaranteed.
They may just be, it's kind of spooky when you're a parent and you just notice all these things you're doing that you recognize your own parents in. It's kind of spooky how it's all in there. And you didn't know it was in there until you had your own children. And suddenly, it's sort of coming out. And yet even then, one can at times intercept it and wonder, does it have to be done this way? And so sometimes we're just laying our anxieties on our children when something much more kind and, should I say, kind and gentle and can do the same thing. One way you can do that with dreams is kind of sit down and in a somewhat meditative way, put yourself back in the dream. And particularly in the feeling of it. Mm. Some of the images and some of the situations, fine, but you might just put yourself in the feeling of it and see where that takes you inside.
Okay.
That's the more feeling route rather than the dream analysis route,
Right.
Yeah. I've actually put yourself back in the felt sense of being there and notice where it takes you in your being. What are there memories that come up? Are there situations? And, dreams are, boy, I sure haven't figured them out. And they can tap into distant corners of us, and yet sometimes it feels really, I use the word wholesome, sometimes it feels good to bring something to light that's in there. Right. And the feeling of the dream can bring you into it.
Okay.
Didn't really learn that from practicing Buddhism, but it's there.
It's all part of it.
It's all part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's all part of it of being open to what's inside of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm also open to the possibility that I said inside of us, but that, of course, is not really true. Everything is in the mind. Everything is mind.
Mhm.
You're looking out at mind. It's not just something inside. And because of that, again, part of our sensitivity is we can pick up on things that are not necessarily personal because those energies are in the mind.
Yeah.
Those streams of energies that are more collective. And you can know that, not just by reading the newspaper or watching the news. Of course, one can know about what the anxieties are that are out there. But on another level, there's something we tap into. So don't presume just because your dreams are anxious that it's really something only personal.
Mm-hmm.
But the only way you'll know that is to go back into the dream and kind of feel into it. And maybe there's a personal level and maybe there's a transpersonal level of some sort to the feeling.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And people can grow older with a sense of confusion about what life is all about. What was this all about anyway? You could just talk with her about it. Let her talk about it. Let her be witnessed. That's really the greatest power you have, is your presence. And, to ask about what life looks like to her right now. And what she thinks about during her day. Might be an interesting question. Where does her mind go? It's, I come from a spiritual tradition that voluntarily puts people voluntarily put themselves into very confined situations in order to do something with their mind. So a retreat where you wouldn't speak. There can be retreats with 100 people, but there's also retreats where you're all alone. Of course, then you have had some training of what to do with yourself and how to turn toward the mind itself for exploration. And there's a world that can open up there in confinement. And sometimes it's just digesting your life, if you still have a mind. And sometimes you don't even have that. But if you have a mind, if you have memory intact and digesting life, there's dignity to it. We don't honor that very much in our culture, digesting our experience. We want people to move on quickly from a loss. We don't want them to wallow in it, as it's called, in that kind of contemptuous way, where you might actually be moving through something that's the most profound thing in your life after a major loss. A deep shift and deep kinds of understandings can come about through that. And we don't give that space. I remember when I was a part more of the Cambodian community in Leverett, there was a relatively young man who showed up, and he was dressed in white. He had taken 8 precepts and told me he was going to spend 3 months in the temple. And because his father had died. And this is an old tradition in Cambodia for a son when his father dies to live in a temple for 3 months. It's like, whoa, what kind of a culture came up with that idea? It's like to give yourself that much time. I know from my own experience when my father died, it was a big deal. It was a kind of turning point in my life. And there was a lot to digest. And, being in our culture, you're always digesting things on the fly. You're always being catapulted from one busy situation to another, and somehow you're supposed to have an emotional life in the spaces in between. And maybe one of the hidden blessings of this pandemic period is people have slowed down. Maybe we just needed a year to digest some of our experience, so we could actually shift to something different. Because, oh my goodness, we need to shift to something different. And it may have taken an entire year of people digesting various things to come to that. I certainly have those feelings sometimes of, but I also think you've got a choice. You don't have to go back to the way you were. It's a little harder because everybody else won't be slowed down.
Exactly.
And you'll be kind of drug along with the momentum of it. But there is an element of choice there to have more space, lead a quieter life. So if anybody wants to answer Allison's question, you can pop in and say yes. But I don't think you're alone from people I've talked to. And you're right, it is a privilege. I mean, those of us who've been able to still earn a living and have a good roof over our heads, it is a privilege to go through it relative to some people. But perhaps if part of our digestion, we may discover we can live more simply and that people in our communities matter to us. They probably always did, but there's some way we may be more conscious about it. And we might actually make different choices in terms of how we are in our communities. It's the franticness, I think, that you're pointing to, that you want to find a way to not have that. Yeah. I'll have to check back in 6 months or a year, see where people ended up with this. You pointed out two things. First of all, the whole idea of the Sabbath, the way that people have integrated this right into their lives every week. And the importance of the fact that it's a community. You do this together. It's not just some choice that you made on your own to have one day of being a week. It's a whole group doing it together. And that also makes it work. It is a similar thing. Most people will find if you do these practices, it really helps to be a part of a group. It really helps to have a sitting group. It helps to have classes like this. It wasn't meant to be done all on your own. The balance, there's the yin and the yang of it, and there is a balance between the two. And I think as a young man, I was very much more on the yang side when it came to spiritual practice, and a lot more effort, more ambition in some ways. And the older I've gotten, the more it has veered towards yin. And my teaching is very yin, you may have noticed. Mm-hmm. It's very much in that direction. But that's not to say that there isn't a place for that yang, from that, effort, will, setting goals, meeting them. that works, especially if it comes from a healthy place. There's a kind of healthy yang and an unhealthy yang. And an unhealthy yang can come from, on some level, a dislike of oneself, you know? And from that need to dominate oneself, of, kind of dominating the feminine in oneself, if I can put it that way, of which we've only had 5,000 or 6,000 years of patriarchy to, condition us in that way, that the softer things in us need to be dominated and overcome. And so spiritual practice has that in it. It's even Buddhism comes from a tradition of patriarchy. And so I'm talking a little bit about my own gradual inner revolution around these matters, and wanting to have my efforting, my will, my limit setting on myself and my limit setting on others arise from a genuine place of inner love and acceptance, and not about inner domination. So that's what I would say about, if you have that kind of yang energy, just kind of check and see where it's coming from. Is it coming from self-love? Is there that core of joy in being myself there, out of which it arises? Or is it in some way, I got to fix myself, there's something wrong with me, I've got to escape this experience, I've got to master my suffering, I've got to master my emotions. One of the weirdest words is meditation master, because it implies to many people somebody who has succeeded in dominating their experience to the point where they're no longer vulnerable. And oh my goodness, does that give people the wrong impression of a spiritual life? It's such a masculine, such a patriarchal take on what this is all about. And what you'll actually find is that inner mastery, if I can use that word in a more wholesome sense, doesn't arise out of dominating yourself. It doesn't arise out of laying standards down on yourself and forcing yourself in. And you'll notice that as soon as you meditate and you try to force the mind to not think, I mean, that's such a yang kind of instruction for meditation, don't think. And you get in there and you follow that instruction and you just suffer, because all the energies of the mind don't want to be dominated. They don't want that. They're like a bunch of cats. All the inner cats of the mind, they don't want that. They want something else to actually bring them into a kind of harmonious, settled place of enjoyment and peace. They don't want domination. So, the yang aspect is necessary to create the space to meditate, for example. Unless you have a little bit of yang to say, I'm doing this and I'm not going to let anything interrupt it, it probably won't happen. That's a yang energy. It needs to be there. But it needs to be in service of the soft. It needs to be in service of the tender. It needs to be in service of that inner core of experience, rather than it being a way of harshing on yourself. So, the model that has kind of worked for me is yin in the core, yang around it.
Wow.
Yang is meant to serve the yin. That is the proper relationship of yang to yin. Yang is here to serve the yin, you know? And there's a possible society to build on that. We ain't there, believe me. That the yang energy is actually here to serve the yin. And that's true of every person, no matter their gender. You know, we gender these things. And I think that has some basis in biology, and probably not as much as we think. But it's a way of talking about two aspects of ourselves in their proper relationship to each other. All right, I realize
really helpful.
Okay, I just realized we've come to that time. So I will send you off into the world.